Hello and welcome again to UCL Global Health. We're continuing our theme of talking about urbanisation, particularly in an African context. And a very important aspect of urbanisation is the edge between the rural migrants and the peri-urban communities. And I'm joined by Julio, Davila, who is director of our development planning unit. And you've spent many years studying this complex subject. And I just wanted to focus on really two areas. One is about land and its management and ownership and what problems that creates. And then we could talk a bit about water. But let's start with land. What are the issues for the peri-urban communities, and particularly on your work in Ghana?
Cities are growing everywhere. Cities are growing. In some cases, they're growing very fast. In some cases, they're growing more slowly. And they're growing because that's where it's more efficient to grow in modern economies. That's where you accumulate more capital faster, the productivity is higher, and therefore that puts pressure on the resources both inside cities and outside cities.
So cities are a good thing?
Cities are a fantastic thing. For me, they're probably the best invention, the best human invention ever. And that's where everything comes. Everything good comes out of cities, except, of course, food, which can also be grown in cities.
Rural areas are good as well.
Rural areas are good, but they're not very good for human productivity
Okay.
or a personal and collective improvement, I think, in many cases. Unless you have an urban lifestyle, which is an expensive thing that only the rich countries can afford. So by and large, when you're at the early stages of development, and you're a relatively poor country, and you start in some way accumulating capital, and the structure of your economy starts changing, cities start growing as a reflection of that. There's a complex process.
So hang on though, but you're at the edge of a city, you're rapidly coming, rural people migrate in, and they come onto traditionally owned land, and then they enter a world where they're buying and selling land. How does that work, and who wins and who loses?
Well, migrants, there are two, simplifying enormously, there are two different kinds of people that are in the peri-urban areas. One is the farmers that were there for a long time. And if you look at the case of Kumasi, land around Kumasi is largely owned and run using customary law. And that's decided by the chiefs.
Kumasi in Ghana.
Kumasi in Ghana, sorry. This is the second largest city in Ghana, of course, with a population of about 600,000 people. And there are people who live there, who have lived there for generations, and they're essentially farmers. But as a city starts to grow, and the pressures that I was mentioning earlier on growth become bigger and bigger, land prices in the city center become higher, people start moving out of the city and to live in cheaper land, essentially. And that includes middle-class households who want a bigger house. They can afford a plot of land and work and a garden. And it's a dream. It's a dream that is almost universal. And what do? They buy these plots of land from the chiefs or through a customary system. There is another kind of population there, which is migrants, as you say, migrants who come from outside Kumasi, from different parts, poorer parts of Ghana and elsewhere. There's a lot of international migrants into Ghana, and particularly in Kumasi, which is a fairly successful city. It's a trading post. Some will settle in the city center temporarily, so others will look for land in the outskirts, the peri-urban area. So there you start to see a lot of conflict and tensions arising over the use and the property of land. You've got, on the one hand, the farmers, traditional farmers with the livestock and the agriculture. You've got close by the middle-class households that arrive and want to build.
But the farmers must win if they're selling their land. They make a lot of money.
Yes, those who own or have a control over the land will win, but those who have no control over the land because they don't have any right to it will lose out. So typically, the chiefs or the representatives who have control over that land will win because they'll earn money. In theory, that money has to be reinvested in the community. But people like elderly women, widows, people with disabilities who are there just by virtue of the goodness of the system, which is, very good.
Because the traditional land is collectively
Yes.
shared, but then goes into the individual ownership of the chief.
Correct.
And so the people that were part of a collective are now landless.
Exactly. People who were part of that collective are landless. And therefore, they lose out. So what we've been trying to do, what we did in this work, which was a little old now, but was to document that process.
Right. So actually, that's the start of quite significant inequalities.
It is a start, and the consolidation of inequalities,
Okay,
and that's what happens a lot.
Well, let's just move on to water and sanitation, because you've done a lot of work in that in other countries as well.
Yes.
For the peri-urban area, you've got infrastructure, you've got increasing water demands. Again, are you seeing huge inequalities that the poorest are no longer able to access clean water and sanitation?
Well, as the same processes are happening, and the pressures on land increase, what used to be peri-urban farmers now are increasingly becoming more and more urban because the city is getting close to them. So without moving, without moving from your place of residence, you're turning from a rural resident into a peri-urban and eventually into an urban resident. It's very interesting because the city comes to meet you. Now that comes with a lot of pressures, and those pressures have to do also with other than land, resources and access to water. Denser places, like cities, cannot no longer rely on water drawn from rivers and streams, or even from digging holes in the ground.
So they're dependent on the municipal structures.
That's right, because
governance.
Water is scarce, is polluted, so they have to depend on municipal. So what we've observed in Tanzania, for example, in Dar es Salaam, which is part of our research we did, is that there's a huge multiplicity of providers of water, particularly for the urban poor, for the peri-urban poor. There is, municipalities are largely absent. They do not have a presence there. So you have people who have, who essentially have dug holes in their grounds and extract water and sell it. People who, with the help of NGOs, have dug bigger holes in the ground and extracting more water, and they sell it to users, usually by the collective. And there's a gatekeeper. There's somebody that actually has a key to a lock and a pump, and they sell the water on behalf of the whole community, and that money goes to pay for the pump maintenance and so on. There's also people who buy water in bulk and then cart it to where people are. So you see quite a lot of bicycles around loaded with these very heavy jerry cans.
But this sounds chaotic. This sounds all over the place. The free market gone mad. Surely you need good old-fashioned Victorian sewers, proper clean water supplies, good municipal governance. Have you found in the emerging cities, final question, have you found the upward pressure that is holding politicians accountable, or is there still a long way to go to do that?
It's a very good question. I think there is still a long way. It's a costly undertaking. Our argument is that centralized municipal systems are by and large a very good thing, but they're expensive, they're costly to build. So you can also think in terms of water and even sanitation of more decentralized systems that are slightly more independent. And there are very good examples in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, of community-managed systems of water collection, purification, and use and recycling locally without the municipality having anything to do with it other than regulate it to some extent.
So they're expensive in the short term, the upfront cost, but in the long term, the returns are huge.
Yes,
the benefits.
The returns are enormous, I agree. And you can see it between the water that you pay little water that you pay from a mains in a municipal service is a fraction of what you pay when you buy it from one of these guys in a cart who's pulling, a cart pulled by a donkey or something. It's really a fraction. So the poor lose out. So yes, as engineers and as planners, our aim ought to be, yes, let's provide these systems which are more efficient and are centrally managed because they're cheaper for the poor. But in the meantime, what do you do with these? I mean, there are cartels that rise of small suppliers, which actually in the end, in some cases, end up exploiting the poor because they have no option but to buy from these people.
This is an absolutely massive issue, and
It
I'm
is.
glad that sustainable cities are one of the grand challenges of UCL alongside global health, because it affects the lives of hundreds of millions, and it's a problem that's getting bigger,
It's getting
not
bigger
less.
as cities
But there are
grow.
solutions, and
There are solutions. There are solutions, and we're looking. I am optimistic. I think, as I said at the beginning, cities are a great thing. They can be a terrible thing temporarily, but that's what we're here. I mean, it's to help sort of advise politicians and communities and private sector and individuals to make the most of that enormous potential that cities hold.
Julio, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony.